What if faith could be about more than easy answers? What if there was a place where you could ask your hardest questions and dig deep into scripture and theology? What if you could learn from leading scholars and practitioners and engage issues that matter most to your community? What if you could have meaningful conversations about faith and consider new perspectives, all without going back to school? The Candler Foundry. Making theological education accessible for everyone. As we come together to learn, grow, explore, belong.
Welcome to Publications, a webinar series hosted by the Candler Foundry at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. The Candler Foundry is designed to bring opportunities for rich theological engagement beyond the walls of the seminary, making them accessible and engaging for everyone. In that spirit, this webinar series features discussions of newly published academic works and invites the broader public, you, into these important conversations that the books engage. What you will hear is not academics offering formal critiques, but rather we hope it will feel more like listening to a few friends chatting on the back porch about what's important, interesting, and exciting. My name is Elizabeth Arnold, also known as EB, and I'm the Scholar in Residence and New Testament teacher for the Candler Foundry. I have the pleasure of being your Foundry host this afternoon, and I have the honor of introducing Dr. Luther Smith. Dr. Smith is Professor Emeritus of Church and Community at Emory's Candler School of Theology. He's an expert on the work and writings of Howard Thurman and an ordained elder in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. We're thrilled to have you all joining us for today's discussion with Dr. Smith on his new book, Hope is Here: Spiritual Practices for Pursuing Justice and Beloved Community. Dr. Smith, there is not enough welcome in all the world to do you justice, but welcome and thank you for being here just the same.
Oh, thank you, Evie. It's exciting for me to have this opportunity, and I'm very honored by the invitation to be here. So thank you very much.
I would love for you to take just a few minutes, as much time as you need, and tell our audience today why you wrote this book, who you wrote it for, and what you hope it accomplishes.
Yes. Many years ago, and I say this at the very outset of the book, I was in conversation with my father, who had returned from a worship service where the guest minister was preaching on 1 Corinthians 13. And that guest minister concluded that sermon by saying, Paul wrote, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love, but perhaps in light of what is happening internationally and nationally and in our local communities, perhaps this is a time where the greatest of these is hope. Well, my father and I were stunned. We had never heard such a conclusion, and we had never even thought about that ourselves, but it started me to really begin to think about what is the greatness of hope, not whether hope is greater than, but what is the greatness of hope? And I began to listen very carefully to how persons used the word hope. I was reading articles and books where people were talking about their personal journeys as well as dealing with issues of injustice. And I was quite taken about folks who were dealing with severe matters could speak of hope with some greater depth than just speaking about wanting hope to come at some eventual time, hope as wishfulness, or a hope as desire. But honestly, in most of the conversations that I would hear people use the term hope, it related to what I would like to have happen, what I want to have happen. And while that's a way in which we speak of hope and it's appropriate, there's something more about hope that relates to its greatness than just my feelings of anxiety or my feelings of fear or my feelings for wanting something good to happen. Hope, as I describe it in the book, is a force of God, a force of God that enlivens us to life. And it's always with God. And because God is always with us, hope is always with us. And we are quite readily aware of speaking about God is love, and wherever we experience God, we can be assured that love is with us. Well, that is also true with hope, because hope and love always travel together. So hope enlivens us to life, and it can serve us when we're dealing with trials and tribulations, with matters of anxiety. But hope is also quite important for us in terms of the way in which we are understanding each day, each week, each month, each year, to live in this spirit, to live with this force of hope. And I speak of the work of hope, which is purposeful, is for a beloved community. That is a community where compassion and justice prevail. And this work of hope is our opportunity to join in the enlivenment that we can experience by attending to these matters of justice and beloved community. It is for us. It can give us joy and shalom beyond anything we have understood. But we also, I think, face the reality that the work of hope disrupts us. It will be calling forth from us more than what we've been doing by way of our habits. It will be requiring us perhaps to reassess not only the lives of others, but our own lives. And in this sense, hope is transformative for us. We're not just talking about a new interpretation of hope, we're talking about a new interpretation of our lives. And how then do we take seriously that hope is inviting us into its work of transformation that is for beloved community? And I think it has proven for me to be a perspective that enables me to deal with trials and tribulations, the anxieties, to grieve, to anticipate suffering, all of those things. They do not leave with this understanding of hope, but there is a way for us to find ourselves very much involved in these realities with a new sense, I think, of direction and joy and understanding and community that prevails in ways that are so different than if we find ourselves only thinking of hope as something that comes from the horizon, as a feeling that must overtake us, without recognizing that hope is right here with us. It's transformative power for us, and it can make such a difference for all of us, even beyond our individual involvement.
Oh my goodness. I mean, absolutely. And I think you accomplished that just in the cover of the book and in the title. It's not just hope is here as a statement, it's hope is here, exclamation point. And one of the things I've always been frustrated is in academic circles, there's this sort of disdain for using exclamation points. And yet throughout the book, you're like, no, this is a force. It's a power. It's not passive. There's no period on the end of it. It's an exclamation point. So thank you so much. And for all of our viewers, we're dropping a link in the chat so that if you want to purchase a copy of it, you've got instant access to look at that. And I highly recommend it. And if this hasn't made you want to read it, well, then I just don't know what. So thank you so much, Dr. Smith. We're going to bring on our panelists in one moment, but before I do, I just want to let you know, as the audience, these panelists aren't the only ones who are invited into the conversation today. You will also have this opportunity to ask your own questions. So simply drop your questions or comments in the chat box, and we will pose those to the panel, to Dr. Smith, whoever they're appropriate for, as the conversation unfolds. So we'll be looking for those. Please don't hesitate to participate. Joining us today are Reverend Dr. Greg Ellison and Dr. Ott Marshall. Dr. Ellison is Associate Professor of Transformative Leadership and Communal Care, and Dr. Marshall is Professor of Christian Ethics and Conflict Transformation, both of them here at Candler School of Theology. Thank you both so much for joining us to discuss this wonderful book.
This is a pleasure. I'm so happy to be here, and it's fun to be with my colleagues and friends.
Oh yeah, all we need is some fried chicken, and we'll be.
Sadly, that's not a. They don't have
at the dinner table with some fried chicken and cornbread. This is a great conversation, man.
So I want to ask you, Ellen and Greg, you are both experts in these fields as well. I was thinking, Ellen, there's a whole chapter on conflict transformation in Luther's book. And Greg, there's a whole chapter on community celebration and also crossing boundaries. So these are things that you are both already very familiar and working in. Was there something, though, that with all your expertise, you were just astounded by, or that really took you by surprise?
Oh, yeah. Can I jump in?
Absolutely.
Greg? First, Evie, thanks for that question. And I do take it seriously as a question about sort of Luther, and Greg and I have common things that we study and continue to learn from. And also, I've got to say that what really hit me this week, sitting with this book, is how much I needed a real word of hope. And the reminder that hope is here and not something that we have or don't have, depending on the developments of a week. So, this is a week when power and wealth are married and on full display, and this sort of progeny of executive actions now that are making a mockery of so many things that we value. And it is a hard week. And so to sit with Luther's words have been such a gift. And the part that I made myself really sit with is the section where Luther is talking about why we resist hope. So it's not just that I haven't been feeling hopeful, I'm feeling discouraged, but it is the ways in which we resist hope. And he names 3 things that we resist: the kind of challenge that when we remember hope, it challenges us. We resist those kinds of challenges. We resist a fear of being disappointed. We resist the fear of suffering. And he has a chapter where he lays these out. And it was those are such helpful words to me. They were kind of convicting this week. And he sort of sticks the landing. This is at the end of, he sticks the landing all over this book. The end of chapter 2, he says, as I have said, at times our major resistance to becoming hopeful is not failing to see hope's immediacy, but not trusting it to respect our aversion to disappointment and suffering. And then he says this: to resist hope is to resist how God endeavors to enliven us. This leads to the most fundamental question in spiritual formation: do I trust God with my life?
Yeah. Man, that's good.
Yeah.
You got some thoughts, Brother Luther?
Thank you. I will go back and read this book. So I appreciate you pointing to things that need my attention. So thank you.
How about I stick with that same question around given my work in the field, what what stood out to me, even beyond my work in the field, I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to engage this book on a number of levels. I have taught it twice already in 2 different classes. And the chapter that the students gravitate to is around transforming conflict. And given the divisiveness in our country, the great subject of conversation is the first part of that chapter, befriending conflict, which some students here find quite difficult as a precursor to transforming conflict. And so professionally, that chapter has been significant, but more personally, the chapter on contemplative praying has been fulfilling and life-giving and challenging in many ways. There is a section on page 81 when Brother Luther talks about a pastoral encounter with a gentleman who I guess had suffered a brain injury. And you talk about walking into this room and ensuring that your body language does not portray shock. As the individual who had endured the injury greeted you with a great smile, yet the injury affected this gentleman's ability to speak. And his wife warned you that the conversation may be unintelligible. Your response to this gentleman with such great graciousness and humility and empathy is what continues to challenge me. You talk about the fact that you said he was speaking what some might consider a forgotten ancient language. And you had prepared some thoughts in terms of meditations that you would read, but you recognized that while reading the meditations were meaningful, he really wanted to have a conversation. And in that moment, I was put in the room with you. I felt like I was sitting there with you as you leaned into this gentleman, and you said you listened, and you really listened. And in that moment, as you were focusing on not just the absence of words, but the heart of this man to truly communicate the depths of his experience, you talk about a miracle happening. And somehow being able to decode this forgotten ancient language. And there's something in there that we'll talk about over lunch, but I'm curious. You said you began to listen to his body. And this is a different kind of body language. And I recounted times of being in context where I don't speak the language and trying my hardest to hear the substance. But this seemed like a deep spiritual listening. And here you make this very concrete statement that active listening overcame your reliance on discernible speech. And that contemplative listening was contemplative praying. And I've been thinking about that, given the divisiveness in our country and the intentionality, but also the spiritual practice of listening to people who may be different, who may be speaking a different language from a different cultural context, from a different political vantage, from a different theological disposition. But to listen to that in a contemplative, prayerful mood also is a foundation, a bedrock of hope. And so that has challenged me. And I want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I intentionally began the section on contemplative practices with contemplative praying because I believe that our alignment with the work of hope, understanding this as a force of God, relies upon the importance of the way in which we give ourselves to communicating with God. Certainly, when we're doing that in a very personal, closeted way, but also communicating with God in relationships.
Yeah.
And communicating with God when we're very active in movements of social transformation, or we're communicating with God in the sense of isolation and frustration we feel about next steps for ourselves. And if I'm going to take seriously the involvement in practices that are transformative, not only for my life, but for the communities in which we live, I believe prayer is a vital part of that. As a person of faith, and even the work I'm doing with people who claim no association with faith, it's crucial for me to have a way of being available and attentive and engaged. And as you know, that whole section on contemplative praying is about listening in a profound way, discerning in a profound way, because so much that we receive out of prayer and listening deeply entails discernment and also engaging. And in this sense, it's difficult for me to know when I'm not praying. If I'm listening and discerning and engaging as part of the rhythms of life, I have to confess that there are moments when it's clear to me that I've moved from one form of prayer to another form of prayer, but I'm never out of this effort of praying. But people have their different ways of interpreting their prayer life. And I'll just say that it relates to the other chapters. The next one being prophetic remembering. How are we listening to the prophets, discerning what they're saying and engage? The chapter on crossing identity boundaries. How are we listening? How are we discerning? How we're engaged? The chapter on conflict transformation. How are we listening? Sometimes we are so basically possessed by our anxiety and conflict, or our efforts to avoid conflict, that we really do not attend to the possibilities and the promise that conflict offers, and recognizing how conflict is not just something that has intruded upon us. Conflict is needed for justice and beloved community. And this matter of celebrating community, how do we really listen about the journey we've been on so that we bring to community the kinds of matters and promises and gifts, attentive to the artists and you, Greg. I mean, what you do with Fearless Dialogues always entails artists. And I think that's so crucial for beloved community. And it is so crucial in every phase of what we're seeking to do in terms of transformation. So yes, thank you.
I love how you frame all of that as an invitation. And you don't drop the invitation when you get to conflict. You maintain that word. And there's this sense of conflict being a form of hospitality, that it's inviting people all to a table, or even internally, it's us inviting all those emotions like our anxiety, our fear, our worry. Those are allowed there too, and we work through those and with those. So I really I love that. So speaking of invitations, and this can be for you too, Dr. Smith, but especially for our panelists, who would you invite like specifically or generally, either way, who would you invite to read this book? Whose hands would you want to put this in and say, this is for you?
Can I start this one, Ellen?
Absolutely.
And so, Dr. Smith has already started this conversation by referencing his own father. And what I recognized in reading this book is there's so many angles or entry points for parents and children, right? What does it mean to listen to father and son? There's a wonderful example about a teacher and student when the teacher is approached by the student and said, "You changed my life." And the teacher's like, "What did I do?" And the teacher said, or the student told the teacher, "You asked, can we go get a hamburger?" And I was like, man, that's such a fascinating story. But recognizing as a teacher, you offer these seeds of hope that you may seem in your mind are just kind of like things that you would not pay much attention to. I also recognize the intergenerational nature of this book. Dr. Smith has a part, for those of you who have not read it, when he really engages his goddaughter about her own narrative. And, there are these pastoral parishioner encounters. I named one of them. There's another one with, Reverend Frank Thomas. And then, there's this engagement with scripture. And so the beauty that I found in the book is that, wherever you sit, there may be an entry point as a parent, as a student, as a teacher, as someone who's seeking a deeper relationship with God, as someone who's trying to engage with people who may be perceived as on the margins. There are places for you to be nurtured here. And that's one of the reasons I enjoy the book.
Mm-hmm. I want everybody to have this book in their hands. So it's just like Greg is saying, it just speaks to you in all dimensions of your life, and kind of the encouraging day and the discouraging day. I think to sharpen my answer a little bit, though, I'll share a story in the book that I like. Greg's been sharing these wonderful moments. There's a wonderful story early on where Luther, you're jogging and are joined by a young child who's asking you questions while you're also jogging along, and you keep answering the questions. I used to X, I used to Y. And finally, the little girl says, "Sounds to me like you used to live a big life," which is such a great line. So I think I'd answer your question, E.B., by saying I'd hope to put this in the hands of anybody who hears themselves saying, "I used to," whatever that was, I used to, because there's a real wisdom and help in this book to go back to doing things that we used to do, even if we're not really feeling them right now. There's something in kind of the power of ritual and your attention to the body throughout this book that is here, right? That sometimes we just have to do things that we believe deeply that we aren't feeling, and we have to do them because they're in our body, and our body will remind us that they are true and meaningful and helpful. And that kind of return to that kind of attention to the body and the rhythms that are deep in us, I think is so important. So
thank you. It's helpful to hear how things written and intended to be, in some sense, meaningful, are registering with dear friends and colleagues. You are both affirming and confirming, so thank you so much for that. I really wanted the book to be important for individuals on a very personal level, as well as the churches that I think are very much struggling to be places of hope and transformation. And I think that's a faith issue for congregations, that there can be this ideal of who we are, but at the same time, there is a real doubt about matters of mission and meaning and capacity, and even whether God is capable of sustaining us in getting involved in matters of justice and transformation. They would never say it, but the way in which churches act suggests this is a real subtopic, or it's part of the null curriculum of congregations, to be very, very attentive to their anxieties about budget and about no one being disturbed, more so than really what I believe to be the clarion call of mission that our faith has upon congregations. I've been pleased with the kind of responses I've received from individuals, from churches that are doing it as a book study, from community activists who are working to establish beloved community with some very challenging issues. I've had conversations with persons working in Ukraine and Romania who are dealing with issues of children being ignored, especially deaf children with whom they're working, and their efforts to answer the question for many of the children in Ukraine: how do I grow up without hating Russians? The whole sense in which the future is being so set in light of current realities of trauma, and they're concerned about how do I understand hope enlivening not only those of us who are working with these children, but the children themselves, to move into the future creatively, rather than simply seeing the future as an opportunity for revenge. And about a month ago, I received word that a whole denomination is using the book for the gathering of its congregations in 2025 as a way by which there might be a denominational impact that comes forth out of local churches in their communities. So it's been surprising, the types of responses, and very much reassuring. And your conversation is all part of that for me, dear colleagues and friends. So thank you.
I think it was in the chapter maybe on conflict transformation where you talk about hope as being an interpretive lens. It's the criteria we use to look at events, and we, like you said, things like traumas and things like that, to look at it through the lens of hope. And so one of our listeners has asked a question about a recent event, and I think they're asking, if we use this as just an example, how could we interpret this through the lens of hope? And she asked about the bishop that gave a prayer at the inaugural address. And this bishop has come under scrutiny and fire for offering very real prayers about this very thing, about hope for displaced people and people on, like you said, on the margins. And it's easy to look at this and think, on one hand, it's hopeful that there's someone saying it, but it's also, some people can interpret this as losing hope, that it's something that people are trying to put aside. How would you say, or all of you, what would you say would be the way to approach this particular event through the lens of hope?
Well, just immediately, I speak about prophetic remembering, and prophets are dealing with responses that can be deadly. It's not just people in opposition to what the prophet has said. And, it's one thing to speak prophetically about peace and to be speak prophetically about caring, but it's when you get specific, which the prophets do,
Yeah.
that's when the trouble arises. And if we're aware of this, we should not be shocked of the kind of reactions that occur when you are challenging structures of injustice that are perpetuated by individuals who are benefiting from the way things are and who are going to mount every possible resistance to anything that's going to disrupt how things are currently going. So that's nothing to be shocked about. I would say it's not anything really to be in fear about. We would be attentive to recognize how to work strategically with this matter. But, it's always been this way. This is work. Dr. King, who we've just recently celebrated, before Dr. King was killed, you would be hard pressed to get a far majority of people who were supportive of the work he was doing. Dr. King was characterized as a troublemaker.
Yeah.
He was characterized as someone who is upsetting the peace of the country. Maybe he has important goals, but he's asking for too much too soon. And and we can elevate prophets after they're dead, but when the prophets are doing their work, this is where this kind of conflict and hostility arises. The last thing I'll say is, I think it's so important for us to live through this time as free persons, not as people who are fearful and anxious, which and some levels of anxiety are important and fear in terms of recognizing what's happening, but to be a free person in the midst of an environment that we know to be oppressive, to know to be challenging, but which we also know is neither going to mute us. We're not going to lose our voices. We're not going to lose our witness. And neither are we going to lose our sense of assurance as we address these matters as if for somehow God is on vacation during this season of our lives. We should be deeper than that and engage it in ways in which we're not just responding out of an awareness of the kind of forces that are mounting to not only take control, but to perpetuate levels of injustice. We really ought to see this as this is our time. We're going to discover things not only about the realities with which we're dealing, we're going to discover things about ourselves, and we're going to discover how God empowers us in these situations as much as God has empowered us on our journey.
Yes, Lord.
Anybody else have anything to add to that? I can't imagine that there is anything more you can say, but I don't want to rush it.
Yeah, I mean, nothing to add. I've just been sitting here thinking about this is our time is something you say throughout the book, and it just comes through so clearly in the epilogue. And so for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I'd invite you to read the epilogue first, because it just speaks right to the moment. I think the other thing that's so powerful about this book and a response to that question about interpretation is that there's a way that we could use a kind of a hope that's more like optimism as an interpretive lens that isn't not helpful. It's problematic in all kinds of ways. And what Luther is inviting us into is a very I mean, it's a sturdy, it's a rigorous, it's a hard-won hope that is an energizing force in the world. And the book is also not soft at all on these challenges of injustice. I've been sitting here, I'm just going to keep reading your words, Luther, but there's this, so this is also in the Transforming Conflict chapter. Luther describes injustice as malignant. It spreads throughout society, corrupting individuals and institutions. Whether we're rich or poor, privileged or oppressed, free or incarcerated, injustice is deadly. This deadly fact about injustice does not ignore that social groups benefit from injustice economically, politically, and in social standing. However, the benefits, this is such a great sentence, the benefits hoodwink many persons into thinking that all is well. First, the very soul of a society is enfeebled if society's institutions, laws, and community activism fail to be based on empathy for the poor and oppressed. Right? Injustice is like noxious clouds that blow across the landscape. So there is nothing soft about this hope. This is, hard won, deeply rooted, present.
To Ellen's point, Brother Luther, there are some folks on who are asking questions about the substance of your hope, the way that you articulate hope. And I'm wondering if you might offer us a concrete definition of how you see hope. As Ellen said, it's not optimism, it's not wishing, it's not pining, it's something altogether different. How do you articulate hope?
Yes, understanding hope as a force is vital, I think, to everything that's being said. And as a force, it's not something that's going to offer itself as in being either described exhaustively or in being analyzed exhaustively. But it still is real and exists with us as much as love is a force. And we're always discovering, I think, dimensions of love that go far beyond the way in which we've conceived it. But we understand love as conveying to us this way in which compassion and caring and being seen and respected are all dimensions of love, but it's always more than it's that, and it's always more than that. And this is, I think, also true with understanding hope as enlivening us to engage in the work of hope, to really enable us to see in ways that perhaps we had not seen before, and to be engaged in ways that we had not. We've talked about transforming conflict. And, one of the things I think that's important is recognizing how at times when conflict arises, there's a part of us, even though we're physically present, we've left the room in another sense because we're so uncomfortable with what's going on. And so hope empowers. Hope has helped me to be present in the midst of conflict, such that I find myself not just attending to my own feelings of anxiety as to what's occurring, and how capable am I in attending to this? Is it going to turn out well for everybody? But when I've been in conflict and found myself at home, having befriended conflict, it has meant something to me personally about not only my capacity to be present to myself in the midst of conflict, but my capacity to be truly available to those who are in the room in conflict with each other, or perhaps even with me. And I hear differently. I have questions that I think are more pertinent to moving towards some kind of advance in understanding. I relax the need that at the end of this meeting, everything's going to be all right, because a lot of times it's not. But I would hope to create the sort of environment and understanding that persons are willing to continue to address whatever is causing this kind of rupture in a relationship, and to know that between this time that we have to close our time together for whatever host of reasons, to the next time, we're not going to let this go if it's going to be something that really must be addressed, and to convey to them in my own demeanor that I'm not running away from this. I'm not demanding some kind of privilege of having the executive orders to decide what ought to happen. But I want to convey to them how much I care about the way in which this conflict is disrupting their lives and disrupting the family, as well as disrupting perhaps the church. And it's that kind of work of hope that is transformative, I think, not only for us personally, as I've put forth this one example, but it's transformative for us institutionally. And I think it's even transformative for us in terms of understanding our faith. Because, and I think, Greg, you heard me speak to this when we've talked about Howard Thurman and his work as a religionist. I think Howard Thurman is both working as a person of religion as well as someone who is working in the transformation of religion. And I think we, in terms of those of us who identify as Christians, I think this work of hope is deepening our understanding of Christian witness in ways that are not as likely to occur to us if we find ourselves having a lesser reading on the meaning of hope. And just finish, because the more you begin to understand hope, I think you also begin to understand love. As I say, they are always together. You have to be leery of any situation where people are speaking about love, but somehow hope is absent, or they're speaking about hope and they are enacting what they think is to be a hopeful outcome, but love is not involved. And this journey into hope and love, into our faith, into God, is a journey that is for us, and it's one that I think God intends for us.
May I ask one last question? I know we're close to time. Is there time, Evie?
Go right ahead. We got plenty of time.
So, Brother Luther, I was quite amazed when you shared with me that you started collecting scraps of research and pulling articles and fielding quotes to write this book nearly 50 years ago. I mean, that gives hope for me in and of itself, that a project can remain relevant if it really hits bedrock. So now that the book is into the world, the baby is growing, you know, I'm curious, after 50 years of study, what you've learned in the last 14 months, based on the community conversations that you've had with congregations, with these activists, with children in different locations, from Pittsburgh to the Midwest, you know, I'm to out in California. I'm curious, given these voices of people, some of whom are looking at this academically, some of whom are looking at it, you know, pastorally, some of whom are trying to navigate really harsh communal conflict. What are you learning about hope that we will not read in the book, but we can hear from your experiences?
Yes. I'm hearing people express the hunger for hope, and especially since the interpretation of hope as optimism or feeling or desire is not working for them. Mm-hmm. And in these last months, I'm more aware of how pervasive this hunger is than I was when I think began work on writing the book. People talk about situations, some of which are quite personal in talking about matters of health, or quite personal in talking about the losses of loved ones. And I've been quite taken with how they've even identified settings that have been in some way addressed through the book that had not been part of my mind when I wrote the book, but it shows how this matter of the work of hope goes beyond even an author's. Everything we write that has any level of depth is usually ended with ellipses rather than with a period and closure. And of course, some people will then go into a second book or a third book as a response to new things that begin to flow for them in that way. But I will say, I have spent this time in the last 14 months listening to people who have read the book and who have questions arising out of their own communities, and their testimonies about the kinds of transformations in which they've been involved, even before they had the book, that really, for me, has enabled me to be all the more a student of hope and a student of the community. As you know, as teachers, Ellen and Greg, we learn so much from our students in teaching. It's not just a matter of what we offer, it's a matter of what we receive, not only about our subject matter, but about things that come through to us just from the students' own lives. So this has been a gift for me as I've traveled and had the chance to be in communities, to see how the work of hope has been going on in some for years, to see how the work of hope has been emerging most recently, and to deepen my own understanding of how persons make adjustments and attend to things in ways that I feel blessed by their testimonies. And I come before them as someone, yes, who has this perspective, but I also come before them as a student.
Yeah, beautiful.
I love that. I love how you continually refer to this is not a linear journey. This is one that is always going to lead to the next thing. And those ellipses, that what happens after this, those are the next books. And so just to sort of start wrapping up our conversation, I thought you really sounded like a Baptist preacher here. In the epilogue, and maybe it's just me in my Baptist stance. I'm like, oh, he's given an altar call, because in your epilogue, you say, we come to this time with opportunities for our lives to answer yes to God's invitation to be a people for justice and beloved community, whether in our neighborhoods or in our nation or a distant land. God waits for us to answer and to live the vision. God's waiting merits our response. To ignore God's vision is to ignore God. What is your response?
Wow.
I have to admit, that landed like a punch in the gut. I was about ready to walk the aisle. I mean, but I think what a way to end this whole invitation, as you have shown us that hope is, but it's also an invitation that we can't ignore. And to not respond to it is to refuse it. And so that is, I love how you keep saying a responsibility. We have the ability to respond to that. And I'm so grateful for that. And to our audience, you will notice that in the chat, Dr. Smith is going to be leading a course on this book that you are available to take. We have some information on that there that will take you right to the registration page. But if you want to continue this work of not just learning about hope, but also being equipped to be able to do these practices and to live this hope in our world and in our lives and communities, we just offer our invitation of hope to you, just as Dr. Smith has done for us. So before we go, any final thoughts that you would love to just share with our audience? If there's one thing that they take away from this conversation that they've heard, what would that one thing be?
For me, it would be the promise and joy of hope is here and now.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Ellen?
Yeah, very much that. I mean, this is not something we need to go looking for or find proof of reason to hope. It is remembering that God has extended this invitation and made it possible. And so it's saying yes to that invitation.
For me, listen deeply. It's a form of prayer.
Amen. Thank you all so much for being with us today. Thank you for your thoughtful comments. Dr. Smith, thank you for writing this book. Thank you for your listening to the needs of the community in order to respond in such not only a helpful, but a lovely way. And so thank you all so much. And we all look forward to seeing what happens next when we get to do this course and we learn more about this hope.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed.